I'm Michael Beck, the host of the MicTheMike podcast. If you've been following along with me, it's great to have you back here again. And if you're listening in for the first time, welcome. This is a place to talk about the arts as well as personal well-being. Sometimes I'll talk more about art, while other times I'll talk more about mental and physical health. But regardless of the topic, I hope to encourage greater openness and understanding as I seek to better understand myself and the things and people around me.
Fake it till you make it, till you cannot take it anymore. I've lived this for so long, I forgot this was wrong. This is my no-no. This is my no-no.
You just listened to a clip of the song Normal from my solo music project Lancaster from album RIP 2019, and welcome to episode 29. In my last episode, you may recall I talked a little bit about self-confidence, and that's where I want to pick up from where I left off with this series on deep conversation. I said, doesn't confidence have so much to do with it as well? Where's the fear in being open and honest about yourself and being open and honest with your thoughts and opinions on various subjects? If you have confidence in yourself and who you are, you don't have to be completely confident in what you're saying, but how much do people's responses and reactions to what we say affect how we view ourselves? End quote. You know, I put in a lot of effort into presenting myself as a good guy who does all the right things. This all stems from childhood. I mentioned in my previous episode that I developed a strong parental voice, constantly judging and chastising me. Someone called this an inner critic. I can never seem to be good enough or ever quite measure up. I've had very high and impossible standards for myself, and in my own way, I'm able to rationalize and make excuses for others, whether actually doing wrong or just falling short of my self-prescribed standards. But so often I can't seem to find the same leniency for myself. I haven't given myself much grace or room for error. It might seem arrogant on some level, like, what do you think you're better than others? Sometimes, yes, if I'm being completely honest, but deep down, that couldn't be farther from the truth. You see, it's not so much that I actually think that I'm better than anyone else. It's just that I believe that I have to try and be better to be at their level, to be worthy of love and of grace, always seeking to compensate for something I believe that I lack. As a little person, this was the default mode in which I operate out of, and a means of getting along in the world and trying to get my basic needs met. I may have been at least partially successful in my attempts. From what I can tell, most people seem to think I'm a pretty okay dude. But as I've grown older, as with many things, I've been realizing that my old learned habits are now causing more harm than good. And in this case, it's become increasingly exhausting trying to keep up a front, and has even become a source of anxiety and depression for me. As I've tried time and time again to be a good person and do all the right things according to my own very strict internal compass of what it means to do the right thing. But I'm only human after all. I'm going to mess up no matter how hard I try or how controlling I try to be. So inevitably, you might say I've fallen into a cycle of toxic shame. I talked a bit about what I believe to be the difference between guilt and shame in my 25th episode, Loving What's Present. I said that guilt is different from shame, and that it doesn't say that the wrongdoing, or sin we could call it, is who you are. Guilt leaves room for healing and growth, but shame says that you're fundamentally broken and cannot change. I'm going to discuss guilt and shame further, and then introduce a new term, toxic shame, which I believe needs to be a part of the conversation. In guilt, the self is not the central object of negative evaluation, but rather the thing done or undone is the focus. Guilt says this behavior is bad, while shame says, I am a bad person. Guilt is about what you do, and shame is about who you are. Shame is associated with a negative evaluation of our entire self-image. So to quickly recap, we have guilt, and then we have shame. And shame definitely doesn't sound positive, and this will hopefully make more sense as I discuss further. But as I understand it, shame can be experienced in a healthy way when it's productive. And what do I mean by that, and how can shame be productive? Well, I believe that we're looking at a spectrum here. On one end, you have guilt, and it acknowledges that the thing that I did or didn't do, that's a bad thing. Maybe the guilt causes you to change your behavior, maybe not. How many times have you and I done something, felt a little guilty for it, but then you just kind of put it aside and move on? Shame, however, can bring us to that place of evaluation. Maybe we did something that truly does reflect negatively on our character, and we need to look at making some changes. Maybe you discover that you have a particular bad habit, you have a behavior you've done several times, and you realize that several separate friendships have been damaged in some way because of this. We're repeat offenders, and we need to make some changes, or else we're going to not only further damage our relationships, but also continue to hurt the ones we love or care about. It could be okay to realize that maybe we're not as great as we thought we were. It's humbling. Shame can be the catalyst for personal growth and can allow us to be reflective and develop empathy for ourselves, because you have to take a hard look at yourself and confront yourself, your whole being, your humanity, imperfections, and all. And it wouldn't be much of a practice in empathy if we were perfect and we never had to forgive ourselves for royally screwing up. Put another way, healthy shame, like all emotions, moves us to get our basic needs met. In other words, healthy shame reminds us of our limitations, for example, when we make a mistake and realize our finiteness, our limitations. I've talked about this before on the podcast. We are limited beings, and I believe that we're healthiest when we can learn our limitations and begin to live within our limitations. We don't need Michael Beck here, there, and everywhere, all up in every business. It's good that there is only so much of me and only so much of me to go around. There are things on my plate that are for me to handle, and there are things which need to be left to someone else. So again, we have a spectrum with guilt, and we can move into shame. Both of these things can be healthy and productive, and like emotions, they can come and then go. Now, when shame becomes toxic, that's when it becomes not only unhealthy, but life-destroying. Toxic shame, coined by American psychologist, and let's see if I can pronounce this right, Sylvan Tompkins, is related to childhood physical, sexual, emotional abuse, and neglect. Those are forms of trauma. However, I believe there are other forms of trauma which may also lead to toxic shame. And going back to the idea that everyone has something, I believe it's not unreasonable to imagine that everyone has experienced some measure of trauma at some point in their life. Some have theorized that the very act of being born is traumatic. However, regardless, I also believe that not everyone who experiences trauma falls into toxic shame, but it can make a person much more susceptible. Once toxic shame sets in, it encompasses the whole of your personality. Instead of feeling limited or realizing that a mistake has been made, you view your whole self as a mistake and of being defective at the core. The difference between shame and toxic shame is a bit nuanced, but again, toxic shame is at the extreme negative end of the shame continuum. It presents itself in the affected individual as debilitating and restricts their ability to express appropriate feelings, feelings which would allow someone experiencing shame to work through their issues and move forward. It's connected with negative self-talk and negative self-imagery. Because of this, a person experiencing toxic shame doesn't really move forward. How can they? They lack the necessary skills. Leaving folks in a cycle of negativity, toxic shame is prevailing. It's much more chronic and long-lasting than shame. It doesn't need to be triggered the same way that shame does. It's like the dark cloud you see in a cartoon. It just settles overhead, and the onset of all this negativity, coupled with the longevity of this negativity, may even change someone's personality. Going all the way back to the idea of confidence, I believe it goes without saying that someone suffering with toxic shame is not going to have a heck of a lot of confidence. The very core of their being is under attack by their own psyche. With an allergic reaction, the body begins fighting against itself. With toxic shame, a person's mind begins fighting against itself. You can't have true self-confidence while also constantly condemning yourself. In this state, being open to new ideas and experiences and to the exchange of new ideas might not be so appealing. I've at least found this to be true for me. I haven't had much empathy for myself at all. I believe myself to be fundamentally broken and undeserving of love and grace for myself and from others. That didn't change that I still wanted to have my needs met, to feel loved and connected with others. But I was like, maybe if I can do enough of the right things, enough of the time, I can convince myself and others that I'm worth something. But all my efforts only made me more critical and made me feel more and more that I would never measure up. And here's the real kicker. Even if I could manufacture someone else's view of me, it would never change the way that I view myself. Even still, being so focused on my persona and feeling like I have to keep up this image of being a good person has not been the level of confidence needed to discuss topics or share opinions which I believe might place my character under scrutiny. So, what then has been the path of growth for me? I'll share these words. My identity is not in being right. My identity is not about being an exemplar of goodness or of correct moral standing. I believe it was Father Richard Rohr who once said something to the effect of, I've been wrong too many times to know that I'm not always right. End quote. It's with these words in mind that I've been motivated and felt able to go through this series on deep conversation and continue to share parts of myself that are less than flattering. Yes, at this point, I must resign myself to the fact that inevitably I'm going to get it wrong. And what then? I'm being human, aren't I? I'm messing up and making mistakes as humans do. I like to think that there's more to me than simply being good or bad. When you get into deeper conversation with either more subjective or controversial subjects, you have to move away from simple dualistic right versus wrong thinking because it's a gray area. I appreciated this quote from Robert Trigger as he was discussing his book, Being a Man in the Lousy Modern World, and talking about the institution of school. He says, and just observing that doesn't mean to say that I'm proposing that we disband all these things, but it's just about developing that awareness, and having that awareness doesn't mean that you're automatically opposed to those institutions. I think that's one of the things I was trying to do in the book, is to build a sense of being able to hold those slightly contradictory positions in your brain at the same time. Don't assume that you have to be either one thing or the other. End quote. And do you know what I've come to realize? I'm a gray area, a walking paradox. Perhaps that's an invitation for someone else as well. There's more to you than being right. I've been in the process of learning how to be more empathetic with myself, maybe working on turning my toxic shame into just shame, you could say. It really is a process, but I do see myself growing and being more gracious with myself and caring less about that good guy persona. I believe that's made all the difference in the world in terms of my confidence. When I'm more confident in myself and who I am, that it's not about me and having something to prove. When keeping up the persona is no longer my focus, it opens me up to being so much more open to sharing what I truly believe and being open to hearing the beliefs of others, and being okay with conflicting views, because it's not about having to be right. When I'm in a healthy place where I can admit my imperfections, that I don't know it all, and have love for myself, I find that I have love and grace to spare to say, hey, it's okay that there's a disagreement. I'm dealing with another imperfect human being who doesn't know it all either. We're both coming from our own unique perspectives. We can share and discuss, and the objective doesn't need to be about proving who's right. Even if we agree on many things, I believe with a productive conversation, the goal should be still to question and redefine what we know and believe. We can play ignorance as bliss, but I don't believe we'll ever develop as strong of a faith in our beliefs as when we can actually think it through and come out the other side. It's not a strong belief if it can't be challenged, but if we can have our faith challenged and still believe, it's like people can knock you for what you believe, but they can't argue with the fact that you're not blind. If a person generally exposes themselves to other ideas, has their beliefs challenged, and still holds on to those beliefs, even if you don't hold those same beliefs yourself, I feel like on some level you've got to respect that. You might argue with their logic, but again, if they've truly had their thoughts challenged, this is not a blind faith. There are plenty of people simply set in their ways and who don't want to have their ideas challenged. So if someone is willing to do that and still holds to a particular perspective, wouldn't it be intriguing to hear from them? At the very least, they're going to be knowledgeable and give different insights. And if we aren't open to that, then maybe we need to consider the fact that we're not that open. I hope you're tracking with me. I'm not implying that we should be open to ignorance or something immoral. I feel like I've made that clear. Yet again, even in those circumstances, perhaps there's always something to be gleaned by peering into someone else's mind. Knowledge is power, right? And if we are so confident in what we believe, then where's the harm in hearing from someone? The vaccine is a hot topic right now, so let's use that as an example. Someone may have a particular view on it to which I don't agree, but I can hear them out and conclude, oh, okay, so that's what you believe and why you believe it. I don't agree or understand necessarily, but I don't have to. I don't have to understand what someone believes in order to accept that they believe it. I understand that the more invested and passionate about something, the harder it can be to accept it. But what's the alternative? We drive ourselves crazy. There are some minds that we aren't going to change, and us fretting about it won't change anything. I'll say this: I'm all about different voices being heard, but at some point there needs to be some practical steps or actions taken, or else it's just a bunch of hypotheticals. It's just words, it's just ranting, and it's beating a dead horse. And it's easy to do. I try my best not to do it myself because that's just about the last thing that I want to hear. Folks going on and on about something, and the conversation never actually goes anywhere. I try to keep coming back to this idea, so I'll say again, as I've said before, I believe we need to be much more concerned with ourselves and our own progress because that's the only real thing we can hope to change. I don't believe we want to be the kind of people who are constantly trying to change others, all the while we neglect to examine and better ourselves. There's so much more that I can say about toxic shame. I believe it's all too prevalent, relating to many of our struggles, and I don't hear anyone else talking about it. I believe this is an elephant in the room, which very much needs to be addressed, but we can't have much hope of addressing it if people don't know about it and people aren't aware and talking about it. And I plan on discussing this more in my next episode, but before I close out this episode, I want to touch on conflict avoidance. In this series on deep conversation, I've covered measures of openness and relating factors, personality and upbringing, confidence, and then guilt, shame, toxic shame. And now, finally, I want to mention conflict avoidance as a factor which prevents us from being open and engaging in deep conversation. Maybe without using the exact phrase conflict avoidance, I'm sure I've touched on this already. It's so much of what avoidance of deep conversation comes down to. And once we get into the weeds of deep conversation, we know that there can be some contention and then you can have conflict. It may seem obvious that conflict avoidance would keep us from having conversation, but on the other hand, I feel like it's something we can be a bit ignorant of. And if we are aware of it, we can often be dismissive and justify it. With the exception of a few personalities out there who are energized by and enjoy conflict, I believe most of us look to avoid conflict, some of us more so than others, but except for the aforementioned people, none of us like conflict. Creating conflict doesn't feel good. It's generally not socially acceptable and is generally not a way to get along with others. Most of us learn from a young age that the less conflict I cause, the easier things go for me, unless maybe you were attention seeking and creating conflict was a means of getting attention, but most people aren't looking for that kind of attention. Society and its institutions encourage conformity and going along with the established and accepted ideas and behaviors, not challenging them. In doing so, one might face being ostracized. I believe we're made for a community and for belonging, so to do something which goes against this and facing the consequences is not something we take lightly. If we take conflict avoidance too far, however, we can create conflict. It can prevent us not only from engaging in deep conversation with others, but we can avoid being genuine and honest with others, with our thoughts, our feelings, and with who we are. Conflict all the time is chaos, but to avoid it all the time breeds its own problems. The problems are more subtle and easy to overlook because it can unfold over a longer period of time, but once it comes to light, the damage has already been done and it can take years to repair and heal from. I'm now going to share some words from Dr. Tom LaHue, and I love that we're going back to water metaphors, and when we get to it, you'll see what I mean. He says this: that idea that we never fight is not realistic. It's not healthy to think that you're never going to have any disagreements, and that conflict is bad, conflict is negative. Conflict means that we shouldn't have gotten married. Conflict means that there's something inherently wrong with us. If you have two people who are individuals that show up in a relationship, that show up fully and aren't afraid to make their wants and needs and desires known, there's going to be differences of opinion in that relationship. That's going to be natural, whether it's husband and wife, whether it's dating couples, whether it's parent and child, whether it's coworkers. There's going to be conflicts to navigate. The goal is not to remove all conflict. The goal is to learn to adapt to conflict and to be able to navigate it in a positive way. When you avoid conflict, and it's within people pleasers to think that whatever I must do to avoid conflict, I'll do because it's just too scary, too frightening. Who knows what you've seen in the past? Who knows what your negative experiences of conflict have been in the past? And so there's within people pleasers this idea that all conflict must be avoided at all costs. When that's the case, when you will do whatever it takes to get along with people and to not be a problem and mitigate your own desires and wants in order to avoid conflict, you never really learn how to deal with conflict because it's always avoided. It's like the idea, let's say that you can't swim, and I say to you, are you afraid of the water? Are you afraid of falling in the water and drowning? Oh, no, I'm not afraid at all. Oh, so you can swim? No, I never learned to swim. I just never go in the water. Okay, so as simple as that little metaphor is, simply avoiding the water, yeah, I guess you never have to worry about drowning because you never go in the water. But there may be a more healthy way to deal with your fear than just completely avoiding the water. What if you could get in the water slowly, get in the shallow end of the water until you feel comfortable and just walk in the water, and then eventually maybe you take some lessons and watch others and practice, and in a slow, mediated way, develop the ability to at least either float or tread water, but then eventually, hopefully, swimming. And then you don't really need to be afraid of getting into a pool or going out into the beach. And now you don't have to avoid water because you've learned to handle it. You've learned to be okay with it. Saying, well, I never have any conflict, so I've learned to adapt because I don't have any. That's not the same as developing skills to navigate through conflict and learn to communicate in such a way as to make your needs known and to negotiate. The goal in conflict should be to negotiate to a compromise or to a place where both feel like both parties feel like they've been heard, understood, appreciated, valued, and both parties win. When we get into conflict, sometimes we can adopt the pattern or the idea that I need to win this conflict no matter what, or I need to give up and just let the other person win. Neither one of these is healthy. Remember, the goal here is not to win a battle. The goal is to win the war. The war is for our marriage. The war is for our relationship as father and daughter, as father and son, as co-workers. The war that we're fighting is to stay together. The dark forces of this world want to separate us and divide us and break our relationships and tear people away from us. So what we are fighting for is harmony and peace and stability and understanding. We are fighting to protect our relationships. We're fighting to protect our homes and our families. And the fight is not with each other. The fight is not with one another. It's against the forces that would seek to disrupt and destroy our relationship. So when we get into conflict, we want to stay focused on our priority, that my goal is not to win this argument. My goal is to win a happy home, to win a happy relationship. And you can say, well, see, if I just avoid all conflict, then I've got it done, period. That's so simple. I'll just avoid all conflict and then I never have to worry about it and I'll just have a happy home. Here's the problem with that. With conflict avoidance, when we don't deal with conflict externally, in other words, between you and I, when we don't deal with conflict externally between me and you, then what happens is, because I'm so afraid of that encounter, I'm so afraid that we're going to be angry, I'm so afraid of upsetting you or being displeasing to you, that I just can't go through this process of discussion and deal with conflict. When you don't handle it externally, what happens is we then have to handle it internally. In other words, the conflict goes internally, and now I'm arguing inside my head. Now I'm frustrated and I'm building up resentment and bitterness and anger, and all of these malice, all of these dark things don't just go away because I don't deal with them. They just go internal. And now I start having the argument in my head. And now as I'm driving away, oh boy, we managed to escape that conflict. We didn't have to argue. Now, as I'm driving away from that encounter, I'm arguing with myself, either saying things like, why is it that she won't even consider my opinion? Why is it that she has to be so angry and so mean? Why is it that she won't take my side on this? Or you're mad at yourself. How come I won't speak up for myself? How come I always give in? I've got to learn to do better. And so the conflict, when it's not dealt with externally between the two people that need to talk about it, then it just gets shoved down. It doesn't go away. It becomes an internal conflict that is actually going to be the cause of building resentment and toxic anger, bitter, hurt feelings in our hearts that, well, guess what, are going to come out later. They're going to leak out in aggressive ways and stubborn ways and passive aggressive ways because it's there. Whether it's dealt with or not in a positive way, it's still there. And now it's going to be, we just don't talk. He just does his thing and I do my thing. And we just found it better that we just can't have these conversations. We just can't talk to one another. And so it's better just to grin and bear it. And it's like, what happened? All this toxic stuff could have been dealt with and discussed and negotiated in a positive way, safe way, but it wasn't. Let's just shove it down. And now, guess what? Everybody's walking on a minefield. Everyone's walking on eggshells because everyone knows just beneath that surface is all this pent up frustration. It never got dealt with. So now it's just below the surface. And so now everyone has to walk on eggshells and everyone has to be careful because the slightest trigger will open up all of that resentment, all of that bitterness, and all of that anger. And so you have to be careful what you say. You have to be careful how you act. And the cycle is just perpetuated. And so the thing that you're trying to do, i.e., avoid conflict, is actually creating an environment of conflict and hostility, end quote. Wow. So does anyone else resonate with that? I know I do. That sounds like the story of my life, to be perfectly honest. And I feel bad about that. I really do. I acknowledge the role that I played, but I also acknowledge the skills and abilities that I never really learned because I was never really taught. And as I've talked about, I believe this to be true of many of us. Going back to that water metaphor, it's like we were raised by people who never learned to swim and just avoided water. And then when we were raised up, never learning how to swim, and we picked up on the message, just make sure that you avoid water and it will be fine. You know, I'm realizing that trauma and mental illness is all too common in families, but more often than not, what happens when there's someone in the family with mental illness is that it's just not talked about. Best case scenario, the individual struggling might get help. The family doesn't actually adapt or become more self-aware. Too often they just buckle down and try to brush it under the rug. And rather than recognizing that there's a history of mental illness and a cycle, negative patterns, it's we're all fine. It's just this person with the problem or these people, these individuals in the family with the problem, but we're okay. I'm okay because we're not like them. I'm not like them. It's the stigma around mental health, a misunderstanding of the mentally ill and a misunderstanding of what therapy is and how it actually works. It's not we need to figure this all out by ourselves because to seek help is a sign of weakness and says that we can't be self-sufficient and self-reliant. It's also not you have a couple of therapy sessions and then you feel better, you're healed, and you can simply move on and put all your past problems behind you. Depending on how long someone's been dealing with something, it can take that much more time to work through it. And if you have a grown adult who's gone years and years with unaddressed trauma, then compounded by the years and years of negative learned behaviors, it's going to take some time, maybe even a lifelong journey of recovery. Every case and individual is different, but progress happens slowly. And people still link violence and particularly gun violence to mental health and can't comprehend the fact that most people struggling with mental illness are way more of a threat to themselves than others. Statistics show that if you give a person with a mental illness a gun, they're much more likely to use it on themselves than on another person. But of course, that goes against the narrative that you hear in fiction and in the media. I don't know how I got onto this sort of offshoot side conversation, but I'm not sure that it is a side conversation, at least not for me. To me, this is related and very relevant and a very real example of deeper conversation that too often isn't had because we lack the knowledge and skills to do so. We can't talk about this if we've been raised and brought up to be insecure, closed-minded, conflict avoidant, and toxic shame-ridden people. And I'm not saying that everyone has all of those things, though some do, but by simply possessing one of these things and never doing the growth work, acknowledging the missteps of the past and learning how to adapt to conflict and deal with it in a positive way, you get generation after generation of families perpetuating old wounds and hurts. And studies are actually now revealing that trauma affects us down to the genetic level, and our minds affect the body, and down to our DNA. We can then pass this on to our children. Regardless of my marital and childbearing prospects, this is the war that I face. Although my immediate family appears well off, there's still a history of poverty, a history of alcohol addiction, of obesity, and mental illness. I know I can't change the past and what's been done, but I believe I need to recognize and face my family's story as I also acknowledge and address my own individual story. At this point, this isn't something I'm ready to address and tackle in its entirety, and there's still plenty of conversations that I would either feel very uncomfortable having or that I feel I'm not ready to have at all, but I'm trying to learn how to have deeper conversation, and in doing so, hopefully also learning how to be more comfortable with conflict. I keep coming back to the idea of slow forward progress, said in many different ways, but it's still the same truth that I'm trying to let sink in. Going back to the way it was described by Dr. Tom LaHue, get in the water slowly, get into the shallow end of the water until you feel comfortable, and, just walk in the water, and then eventually, maybe take some lessons or watch others and practice in a slow mediated way, develop the ability to at least either float or tread water, but then eventually, hopefully, swim. And then you don't have to really need to be afraid of getting into a pool or going out into the beach. And now you don't have to avoid water because you've learned to handle it. You've learned to be okay with it. I'll have to think about where I am at in my own progress. I don't know if I can say for certain. Perhaps I'm just walking the shallow end, but I know that that's farther than I've come before. Even 5 years ago, if you told me that I would one day be writing scripts and sharing my thoughts through a podcast, I can't imagine I would have believed you. But here we are. I'm going into my 30th episode. I'm turning 30 this coming February. Who knows what will happen? But thank you, as always, for joining me on this journey. Thank you for tuning in to Mike the Mike. If you have any comments or have a suggested topic for a future episode, or if you would like to inquire about joining me on the podcast, you can email me at beckm.podcast@gmail.com, or you can direct message me on Instagram at MicTheMike.fm. You can find all those addresses mentioned, as well as any related links and citations for this episode, listed in the episode's description. Until next time, stay well and take care.